The halls of Winterfell were quieter than usual that evening. Snow fell gently outside, covering the courtyard in a white blanket. But inside the great hall, Jon Snow sat alone by the fire. Ghost lay beside him, eyes half closed, ears twitching at every creak in the wooden beams. Jon wasn't a man of many words, especially not these days. The war was over. The Night King was gone. Daenerys was gone too. And with her went every plan, every throne, every dream others tried to place on his shoulders. But tonight wasn't about Daenerys, nor the war, nor even the Iron Throne. Tonight was about a woman he never met, yet carried in his blood. Lyanna Stark, his mother, Ned Stark's sister. Robert Baratheon's lost love, the woman both men had sworn to protect in different ways, and had failed. Jon stared into the flames, thinking about what Sam told him months ago, that he wasn't Jon Snow at all. He was Aegon Targaryen, son of Prince Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark, a child born of love, not rape, a child hidden to be safe, a child who was everything Robert had wanted but never got to claim. Jon clenched his jaw. That name, Robert Baratheon, felt distant and close all at once. He had grown up hearing stories about Robert from King Robert himself when he came to Winterfell. A large man with a booming voice who laughed too loudly and drank too much. A man who had once been close with Ned, Jon's supposed father. A man who had raged against Targaryens for taking Lyanna, not knowing she gave herself willingly. Now Jon knew the truth. He knew Robert had fought a whole war, killed thousands and taken a throne, all for the sake of a lie. But here was the twist of fate Jon couldn't shake. He had become everything Robert wanted. Not Joffrey, not Tommen, not even Gendry, Robert's bastard, kind as he was. No, it was Jon, Lyanna's real son, raised as a bastard in the snow-covered north, who had grown into the very man Robert dreamed his own heir would be. He remembered what Ser Davos once said about Robert. He was a good man at the start. But war, love, and power ruin even the best of them. Jon could believe that. Robert had loved Lyanna so deeply he lost himself when she died. And what did he have left? A crown that meant nothing. A throne that gave him no peace. A kingdom falling apart beneath him. And children who weren't even his. Jon shifted in his chair, the firelight flickering across his face. He had no claim to peace either. He never wanted the throne, never asked for any crown. Yet fate pushed him, again and again, into positions of power, of leadership. Commander of the Night's Watch, king in the north, and nearly the ruler of all Westeros, if not for what he did to Daenerys. Would Robert have been proud of him? That thought sat heavy in his chest. He imagined Robert in his prime, young, broad-shouldered, wielding a warhammer and laughing with Ned. He imagined Robert seeing Jon fight the White Walkers, lead armies, take wounds, and rise again. He imagined Robert seeing Jon refuse the Iron Throne, just as the realm begged him to take it. Would he have called him weak? Or would he have seen a glimpse of Lyanna in him? The stubbornness, the honor, the quiet storm. There was a knock at the door, a soft one. Ser Davos stepped in, his face gentle as always. "You all right, lad?" he asked. Jon nodded slowly. "Just thinking. About her?" Jon looked up. "How did you know?" "Because that's the same look your uncle had when he spoke of Lyanna. The same pain. The same ghosts." Jon didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, "Robert hated Rhaegar, but I'm his son." Robert hated what he thought Rhaegar did, not the truth. Truth was buried beneath years of lies and rage. Jon looked back at the fire. "I think," Davos added, "if Robert had lived to know the truth, he might have seen you as a chance to fix what he lost. A second chance at a son. The one he never had." Jon didn't answer. His chest felt tight. So much pain. So much loss. And all because people like Robert chased dreams based on lies. He wasn't bitter, not truly. But it made him wonder how different life could have been. If Robert had raised him. If Lyanna had lived. If love had been enough to stop a war. But fate chose another path, a darker one, a path where Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, would grow up to be the man Robert Baratheon always wanted, but never had the heart, the time, or the truth to see. And so the snow kept falling, quiet, relentless, just like Jon, Why Jon Snow became everything Robert wanted his son to be. Each part continues naturally, and this one goes deeper into Robert's past and Jon's reflections as truths unravel. The next morning brought no sun, only a pale grey sky that hung low over the north like a brooding memory. Jon stood on the battlements of Winterfell, watching the land stretch endlessly in all directions. Snow covered everything, roofs, stones, trees, as if the world itself was trying to bury the past in silence. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. He thought about Robert Baratheon again. Not the king who drank himself to death, but the young rebel, fierce, strong, full of fire and blind loyalty. Ned Stark had rarely spoken of Robert in depth, only in fragments. A battle won here, a girl lost there. But the emotion in Ned's voice, whenever he mentioned Robert, had always been complicated. Jon remembered hearing it even as a boy. "Robert was like a brother to me," Ned had once said. But brothers don't always see the same war. Now, knowing the truth, Jon understood what Ned meant. Robert hadn't fought for justice. He fought for love, or his idea of it. He believed Rhaegar stole Lyanna, that the Targaryens needed to be crushed for it. But Lyanna wasn't taken. She left of her own will. She married Rhaegar, loved him, and died giving birth to Jon. So all that blood, all those lives, for nothing. Jon clenched his fists on the icy stone wall. The rebellion had burned a kingdom just so Robert could chase a lie. And yet, despite all the chaos Robert caused, Jon couldn't bring himself to hate him, because somewhere deep inside, he felt sorry for the man. Robert lost Lyanna, lost himself, lost everything. And in her place, he got a throne that couldn't fill the hole she left behind. Jon knew that emptiness too well. Later that day, he found himself walking through the crypts of Winterfell, lantern in hand. He moved past the stone statues of long-dead kings of the north, their cold faces watching him as he passed. And then he stopped in front of her. Lyanna Stark. Her statue stood solemn, hands folded, eyes cast downward as if she too mourned something she couldn't name. Jon stood there for a long time. "I don't even know what your voice sounded like," he whispered. His voice echoed against the stone. "I was told you were beautiful, fierce, proud, but more than anything, I was told you were Robert's love." He took a step closer, heart heavy. "But I wasn't his son. I was his enemy's, and still I became the man he wished his son would be. Isn't that funny?" There was no answer. Only the sound of dripping water somewhere deep within the crypt. Robert wanted a warrior, a king, a Stark by heart, even if not by name. His voice was lower now. He wanted someone brave, someone with honor. He laughed bitterly. "Well, I've bled for this realm, died for it, killed for it, and I still carry no crown. I've seen monsters beyond the wall, fought the dead, watched dragons burn cities, and all I wanted was peace." He looked at the stone face of his mother. But peace was never meant for people like us, was it? As he turned to leave, a voice interrupted him. "I never thought I'd find you talking to statues, Snow." Jon didn't need to turn to know who it was. Tyrion Lannister. The last time they saw each other, Tyrion was walking into exile, the weight of his choices hanging around his neck like a noose. But now, here he was, standing just beyond the shadows, hands clasped, a ghost of a smirk on his lips. "You followed me?" Jon asked, surprised but not angry. "More like I followed my regrets," Tyrion said, stepping forward. "And one of them happens to wear a black cloak and talk to dead women." Jon gave a faint smile. "She's my mother," Tyrion nodded. "And Robert's greatest love." Jon turned back toward the statue. "He never knew I was hers." "No," Tyrion agreed. "But if he had, I wonder, would he have killed you for being Rhaegar's son, or embraced you for being Lyanna's?" They both stood in silence. Tyrion lit a small torch on the wall and leaned against the cold stone. "I think," he continued, "Robert might have seen himself in you. The young version, before the wine, before the throne." "He hated Targaryens," Jon muttered. "He hated what they stood for. But he loved what you became." Jon tilted his head. "I've seen what kings can become," he said. "Mad with power, obsessed with legacy." Robert wanted a legacy, but he couldn't raise one. Tyrion shrugged. Sometimes the gods are cruel poets. They gave Robert everything he wanted in someone else's child. Jon didn't say anything, but in his heart, he knew Tyrion was right. He didn't want to be Robert's heir, or Rhaegar's, or anyone's. But still fate had carved him into exactly that, a warrior without greed, a leader without hunger, a king without a crown. The son Robert dreamed of, the son Rhaegar died for, and the son Lyanna gave her life to protect. The north always felt heavier in winter. Even the air had weight. It pressed against your lungs, your thoughts, your memories. Jon stood outside the stables that evening, brushing down his horse in silence. His fingers moved automatically, rhythmically, over the animal's coat. The cold bit through his gloves, but he didn't mind. He needed something to keep his hands busy, something to keep his mind from drifting back into the past, to Lyanna, to Robert, to all the things that could never be changed. But it was impossible not to think about them. Not when you've spent your entire life believing you were nothing more than a mistake, only to discover that you were, in fact, the product of two people whose choices changed the fate of the entire realm. Jon had been raised to believe honor was the highest virtue. Ned Stark drilled it into him without ever having to say it aloud. But now he realized that even Ned, quiet, noble, unshakable Ned, had lied for nearly 2 decades, all to protect Jon from the truth. A truth that would have gotten him killed if Robert ever found out. Because Robert Baratheon, for all his charisma and boldness, was ruled by 2 things, his love for Lyanna Stark and his hatred for House Targaryen. And Jon was the living contradiction of both. He remembered a moment long ago when King Robert first came to Winterfell. Jon had been just a boy, standing among the other Stark children. Robert barely looked at him, though Jon remembered the way the king's laughter boomed through the hall, the way he slapped Ned's back like they were brothers of old. And he remembered the way Robert stopped at Lyanna's statue in the crypts, the way his voice had trembled when he whispered she should be buried on a sunny hill. Even back then, Jon had sensed the sorrow in the man, the weight of loss behind the armor and ale. But now, that scene took on a whole new meaning. Robert mourned a woman he never really knew. He chased an idea of her, sweet, innocent, his to protect and possess. But Lyanna had never belonged to Robert. She had chosen love over duty, and Jon was the result of that choice. If Robert had known, would he have seen Jon as a betrayal of Lyanna's memory, or a piece of her that lived on? Jon didn't know. Maybe no one ever would. As the horse neighed softly, Jon looked up to find Sam approaching from across the yard. Wrapped in a thick cloak, cheeks red from the cold, Sam still managed to look like he belonged more in a library than in the wilds of the north. But Jon was always glad to see him. "Thought I'd find you here," Sam said, slightly breathless. Jon gave a small nod. "I needed some air." Sam hesitated. Then he stepped closer. "I was reading some old letters. Maester Aemon's scrolls. There was something strange, something he once said about Robert." Jon raised an eyebrow. Sam continued. "He called Robert a king of the sword, but not of the soul. Said he had strength but no stillness, fire but no warmth." Jon listened quietly, letting the words sink in. "And you," Sam added, "you're the opposite. You don't want power, but people follow you. You make choices because they're right, not because they'll make you famous." Jon didn't reply immediately. Then he muttered, "And what did it cost?" Sam looked at him, eyes soft. "Everything." Jon nodded slowly. "Then was it worth it?" "You're still alive," Sam said. "And so are thousands who'd be dead if you hadn't led them. That has to count for something." Jon turned back to the horse, brushing slower now. "I keep thinking," he said after a while, "maybe I wasn't supposed to survive. I died once, remember? Maybe that was meant to be the end." "But it wasn't," Sam replied. "You were brought back for something." Jon laughed bitterly. "Maybe just to suffer through the truth." Sam stepped closer, voice low now. "I think you were brought back to break the cycle. Robert's rage, Rhaegar's obsession, even Daenerys's fire. All of them wanted to change the world through power. But you—" "I just wanted peace," Jon interrupted. "Exactly," Sam said. Jon looked out into the night. Snowflakes danced in the lantern light, silent and endless. Somewhere beyond the walls, wolves howled. Maybe Robert could have been a good man, Jon said, if he had known the truth, if he'd let go of his hate. Or maybe, Sam said softly, he was always meant to fall, so someone else could rise. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was no anger, just a quiet sorrow for a man who had lost everything to his own broken heart. Robert Baratheon had dreamed of a son like Jon Snow, but fate had given him only ghosts. And Jon, born in the shadows, became the legacy neither man ever saw coming. Why Jon Snow became everything Robert wanted his son to be. That night, sleep came to Jon like a thief, slow, unwanted, and full of unease. He dreamt of flames, of steel clashing against steel, of Lyanna screaming in a tower, her hands stained with blood as she cradled a newborn. The cries of the child echoed louder than the sounds of war below. Then he saw Robert, young and furious, storming through fire, swinging his warhammer with reckless hate, crushing skulls that wore the dragon's crown. And Jon stood between them all, Rhaegar, Robert, Lyanna, like a shadow that didn't belong to either side. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, breath sharp in his chest. The fire in the hearth had gone out. Ghost lay near the door, his red eyes watching silently, as if he too had seen something he couldn't explain. Jon sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face with calloused hands. The truth wasn't a comfort. It was a burden, a crown made of thorns. He was tired of carrying it. Later that morning, Gilly offered him tea. She didn't ask many questions, but Jon could feel her concern in every gesture. He thanked her quietly and stepped outside, letting the cold wind slap him fully awake. Tormund was leaning against a post nearby, skin like leather and beard, wild as ever. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the wildling said. Jon gave a small smile. "Maybe I have," Tormund snorted. "Well, if you're not sure, it's probably real. Ghosts love following men like you." Jon didn't answer. He just looked out over the horizon, toward the distant mountains. Beyond them was the land he had once called home, the Wall, the Wild, the place where he had first learned who he really was. Not by blood, but by action, by survival. And yet, even out there, he had been carrying someone else's name, someone else's fate. "You still thinking about that king?" Tormund asked suddenly. "Robert," Jon said without turning. "Aye, him. You keep muttering about him in your sleep like he owes you silver." Jon let out a breath. "He doesn't owe me anything. He never knew me, but he hated who I came from." "Then he was a fool," Tormund said. "Hating a boy for the sins of a father? That's something Southern lords do." Jon finally turned to him. "He was in love with my mother." Tormund's brow furrowed. "And she died because of that love. Because two men wanted her more than they wanted peace." Tormund scratched his beard. "I've known women like that. They don't need men to start a war. They just breathe, and men go mad trying to keep their attention." Jon smirked despite himself. "But you're not those men," Tormund continued. "You don't fight for love or glory. You fight because someone has to. That's what makes you different. That's why they keep putting crowns on your head." "I never asked for any crown," Jon said, voice low. "Exactly," Tormund said. "That's why you deserve it." Later that day, Jon walked through the armory where the younger fighters trained. Some were wildlings learning to handle steel instead of bone clubs. Others were northerners, sons of bannermen, eager to prove themselves. They all stopped when Jon entered. He hated it, how their eyes followed him, how their posture straightened. They didn't see a man. They saw a legend, a name carved in war. But what none of them understood was that every title Jon had ever earned had been soaked in blood, friends lost, love killed, innocence buried. And still, they looked at him like he was the man who could fix things, bring balance, be the king they never got. He saw in their eyes the same hunger that had lived in Robert Baratheon once, the hunger for a leader they could follow without fear. Someone honest, someone like Jon Snow. As the sun set, Jon visited the Godswood. The heart tree stood tall, ancient, its red leaves trembling in the wind like whispered warnings. He knelt beneath it, not to pray, but to speak. "I don't know what I am anymore," he muttered. "Stark by name, Targaryen by blood, Nothing by choice. He paused. Robert wanted a son with Lyanna. He wanted someone strong, noble, brave. But if he had known who I really was, would he have killed me or loved me? The wind stirred the branches above him. I'll never know. But I became that son anyway, didn't I? I lived like a Stark, fought like a Northerner, led without craving power. And every time I turned away from the crown, people respected me more. He looked up at the carved face of the tree. I was his dream, but born of his nightmare. There was no answer, just silence. But it was enough. In that moment, Jon realized something that cut deeper than any sword. Robert didn't just lose Lyanna. He lost the chance to be the man he wanted to be. A father, a king who ruled with love, not rage. And maybe deep down, he would have seen Jon not as an enemy, but as the last echo of a life he could never have. And Jon, he would carry that echo with him until his last breath. 3 days passed. Jon remained at Winterfell, walking its grounds like a ghost in his own skin. People gave him space. Even Sansa, who now ruled the north with quiet grace, seemed to understand that Jon wasn't just haunted by war, but by truth. Not just the truth of who he was, but the truth of who he could never be. He stood in the solar, reading old letters passed down through Maester Luwin's careful hands. Most were from Ned, some addressed to Benjen. One buried beneath stacks of weathered scrolls caught his attention. The seal was broken, the parchment yellowed, but it bore the unmistakable signature, Robert Baratheon. Jon's eyes narrowed. He unfolded the letter slowly. To Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. It was dated shortly after Robert had taken the throne. The war was over. The dragons were dead, or so they believed. Lyanna was gone, and Robert was a king with nothing but ash in his hands. Jon's heart pounded as he read the words aloud, just above a whisper. I dream of her, Ned, every night. I see her with that crown of winter roses, and I feel nothing but failure. You told me once to let go. I can't. I never will. They tell me I have a kingdom to rule. I tell them I want her back more than the Iron Throne. I would have burned all of it for her if I had known, if I had seen how it would end. The Targaryens are gone. The boy, the last one, Rhaegar's child, he must be dead. If he isn't, he will become my greatest sin, because I will not forgive the blood of the man who took her from me. Not even if it's just a babe, but God's. If it was hers, would I have the heart to kill it? Jon stared at the parchment, his throat tightening. That boy, Reg, was him. He folded the letter carefully, hands trembling. For years, he had wondered what Robert would have done if he had known the truth. Here was the answer, written in ink, full of rage and regret. Robert's love had been so twisted by loss that even a child, his dream made flesh, might have died by his hand. Jon leaned back, exhaling slowly. It was like hearing your own death written in a stranger's words. That evening, he found Sansa standing by the ramparts, watching the wind play with the falling snow. You've been quiet, she said without looking at him. I found one of Robert's letters to Ned. Sansa turned to him slowly, her eyes cautious. He said he dreamed of killing me, Jon added. If he ever found me. There was a pause. Did he know who you were? She asked. No, Jon said. That's the point. He hated me before he even knew me. Sansa was quiet for a moment. Then that's what grief does to men like Robert. It poisons them, makes them worship the dead and destroy the living. Jon looked down at his hands. He wanted a son with her, someone strong, honorable, a real heir, not a Joffrey. And he got one, Sansa said gently. Jon met her gaze. He got you, she continued. But fate played a cruel trick. You were born from the man he hated most, which means he would have rejected you, even if you were everything he dreamed of. Jon didn't speak. He didn't need to. It was written all over his face. He wasn't mourning Robert Baratheon. He was mourning the idea of what could have been. Later that night, Jon went back to the Godswood. He knelt again beneath the heart tree, the red leaves brushing his shoulders like the hands of an old friend. I read his words, he whispered. He said he couldn't forgive Rhaegar, not even if the child was innocent, not even if it was yours. The branches swayed above him, creaking softly. I wonder what kind of man I would have become if he'd raised me. If you had lived, if Rhaegar had lived. Would I still be the same? He looked up at the carved face in the bark. Maybe I'm not a Stark, not a Targaryen. Maybe I'm just what's left over after everyone else died. The wind answered with a long sigh. Jon lowered his head. I tried to be the man he would have wanted, the man the realm needed. I bled for people who would have gladly killed me if they knew my name. I gave up everything, and in the end I'm still alone. Ghost padded over, sitting beside him with a low huff. Jon laid a hand on the direwolf's fur. He got his throne. I got the wall. Maybe that's justice in some strange way. But even as he said it, Jon knew it wasn't true. Robert had died bitter, broken by his own dreams. Jon had lived long enough to see his fulfilled, and it still brought him no peace. Why Jon Snow became everything Robert wanted his son to be. The next morning came with a rare break in the clouds. The sunlight, pale and cold, spilled over the snow-covered stones of Winterfell. It gave the castle an almost ethereal look, like a place between the living and the dead. Jon stood near the blacksmith's forge, watching Gendry swing his hammer, sparks flying with each blow. He hadn't spoken to Gendry much since the war ended, not really. But now, seeing him work, something stirred in Jon's chest. Robert's blood ran through Gendry's veins. Bastard blood, yes, but still his. Maybe the only part of Robert left that didn't reek of failure. Gendry looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. Didn't expect to find you here. Jon nodded toward the sword on the anvil. Good steel. Better than what I had in Flea Bottom, Gendry smirked. Guess being a lord comes with perks. There was a pause between them. Then Jon spoke. You ever think about him? Your father? Gendry's expression shifted. Sometimes. Not much to think about, really. He never acknowledged me. Just left me in a brothel with my mother. Jon nodded. He thought he was protecting you, or hiding me, Gendry said, setting the hammer down. Funny thing is, I never wanted anything from him. Not a name, not a throne, just maybe to know who he really was. Jon looked down at the snow. He was a man who couldn't let go of the past. Gendry tilted his head. And what about you? Jon didn't answer right away. Then he said, I don't think I have a past. Not one that's mine. They walked together for a while, the forge fading behind them. Gendry broke the silence. You're more like him than I am, you know. Jon glanced sideways. Robert. Gendry nodded. Yeah, not the drunk fool he became. The man people talk about when they remember the rebellion. The warrior. The leader. The one who'd die for his friends. That version. I never met him, but you. You remind me of the stories. Jon looked away, unsure whether it was a compliment or a curse. Difference is, Gendry added, you didn't let power rot you. You gave it up. He couldn't. Jon stopped walking. The cold bit at his cheeks. Robert lost Lyanna, and he lost himself. I lost her too. And maybe I lost something in me too. But I kept going. Gendry nodded solemnly. That's what makes you stronger than him. That night the hall was warmer than usual. Sansa had arranged a quiet supper for a few close allies. Nothing formal, no titles, no court politics. Just food, mead, and a bit of laughter. Jon sat near the end of the table, mostly silent, listening to Podrick tell a story that made even Brienne chuckle. For a brief moment he felt almost normal. Almost. But then the talk turned, softly, inevitably, to kings. Westeros needs a ruler like Jon, someone said. He turned down the crown, another reminded. Aye, said Tormund, raising his cup, and that's what made him worthy of it. Jon felt the weight return like a stone on his back. He excused himself, left before dessert. He didn't want to be celebrated. He didn't want their thrones, their praise, or their need. He wanted peace, a quiet life, the kind that men like him never received. Back in his chambers, he stood before the fire, watching the flames dance. And he whispered, almost to himself, You would have hated me, wouldn't you? He was talking to Robert again. You saw Targaryens as monsters, as thieves. You blamed Rhaegar for everything. You never knew she loved him, that she chose him. You never let that truth live long enough to matter. He stepped closer to the fire. I became the man you wanted your son to be, not out of legacy, but because someone had to. Jon's voice lowered. And the tragedy is, if you'd ever met me, really met me, you might have killed me just for the name I never asked for. There was a knock at the door. Davos entered, slow and steady. "I heard what they were saying at supper," he said. "About crowns, kings." Jon didn't turn. "I'm not a king. I've never been one. You've been everything a king should be," Davos said. Jon stared into the fire. Robert was a king, and it destroyed him. Davos stepped forward, voice thoughtful. "Robert wore the crown like a curse. You carried the kingdom like a burden." "That's the difference." Jon said nothing. "I followed Stannis because I thought he was the rightful king. I followed Daenerys because I thought she would bring justice. But I followed you because I believed in you." Jon finally turned. "And what did that belief cost?" Davos gave him a sad smile. "Sometimes the best leaders are the ones who never sit the throne. But their shadow falls over every man who does." Jon looked down. "Robert never had a son," Davos added. "But if he had, I think he would have wanted one like you. Fierce, loyal, just even if it broke his heart." Jon didn't answer. He just stood there, the fire cracking, the snow falling beyond the window, and the ghost of a king long dead fading into the night. The next morning, Jon walked alone beyond the walls of Winterfell. The snow was lighter now, the storm having passed. The wind had softened too, and the cold that once bit through his skin now only whispered at his edges. He didn't bring ghosts this time. He didn't bring guards or companions or even a sword. He just needed to be alone. Not as Jon Snow, not as Aegon Targaryen, not as king in the north, just Jon. He wandered through the trees beyond the Godswood into the stretch of forest where silence felt sacred, and the crunch of snow beneath his boots was the only sound. The weight of legacy still clung to him like frost on his shoulders, but today it didn't feel as heavy. Maybe he was growing numb to it, or maybe finally he was ready to let it go. He found a small clearing where the trees opened, like they were offering space for something to be remembered. Jon knelt in the snow. "I don't know who I'm praying to," he muttered aloud. "The old gods, the seven, or just the dead," he sighed. "But I want to talk, even if no one's listening." He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded letter, the one Robert had written to Ned, the one that questioned whether he could kill a child if it carried the blood of Rhaegar Targaryen. Jon stared at it again. "You feared me before I was even born," he said softly, as if Robert were standing across from him. "Because you thought Rhaegar stole your future. You thought he took Lyanna, but she left on her own. She chose him." He paused. "And she died for that choice." There was no anger in his voice now, just sadness. "I don't blame you for loving her, but I hate what that love turned into. It became poison. You let your heart rot, and you built a kingdom on top of its corpse." He placed the letter down in the snow. "I became the man you wanted, the warrior, the leader, the one who would protect the people. And yet, I was the one person you would have destroyed if you had known the truth." His hands shook slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper. "I'm tired of carrying other people's dreams. Tired of living in the shadows of men who burned the world just so they could feel powerful." He stood slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Your war gave birth to me. Your grief gave birth to your crown, and both left nothing but ruins." He lit a small flame from the tinder he brought and let it catch on the corner of the letter. The parchment curled and blackened, the words of a dead king turning to ash at his feet. The fire was small, but it was enough. "I forgive you," Jon whispered, "but I won't be you." He returned to Winterfell just before dusk. Sansa met him near the Great Hall. "I was worried," she said. "I had to say goodbye," Jon replied. "To whom?" He didn't answer right away. "To the idea of someone I never got to be," he said finally. Sansa studied his face, searching for something. "Pain, maybe, or resolve." She found both. "I've decided," Jon said. "I'm leaving." Her eyes widened. "Where?" "North. Beyond the wall. Back with the free folk." "You don't have to," she said quietly. "You've done enough. You can stay, rest." "I can't rest here. This place, it remembers too much. I need to find peace, Sansa, and I won't find it in a castle built by ghosts." She stepped closer and took his hand. "You may not have been Robert's son by blood, but you were his redemption, even if he never saw it." Jon looked into her eyes. Maybe, but I don't need to be anyone's redemption anymore. I just want to be a man again. She nodded, her grip tightening just a little. You were always more stark than any of us. That night he sat by the fire one last time. Ghost curled beside him, quiet and alert. Jon looked around the room, the walls, the chairs, the hearth. It had been his home for so long, but it was never truly his. Not really. He thought of Ned, of Lyanna, of Robert, of how their choices built the path he walked. And now, for the first time, he was choosing something for himself. No throne, no title, no prophecy, just freedom. Why Jon Snow became everything Robert wanted his son to be. A quiet reckoning, a farewell, a man stepping out of the shadow of two dead kings. The gates of Winterfell creaked open as dawn spilled soft gold across the frozen earth. Jon Snow rode at the front of a small column. No banners, no fanfare, no royal procession. Just a man in black on a pale horse with Ghost by his side and a few wildlings trailing behind. Tormund rode not far off, grinning as the wind whipped through his wild red beard. "You sure about this, Snow?" Tormund called out over his shoulder. "No throne waiting up there, no crown. Just cold and bad food." Jon gave a faint smile. "That's all I've ever known." Tormund let out a booming laugh. "Then you were born to be free folk." The others laughed too, but Jon only looked ahead. The wall was days away, and beyond it freedom. Not the kind people write about in songs, but the real kind. The kind that didn't come with thrones or names or bloodlines. Just silence, simplicity, breath. As they crossed the ridgelines and snow-covered trails, Jon's thoughts wandered like a man stepping through his past one last time. He thought of the letter he burned. The words Robert wrote to Ned. How a man could be so full of love and hate at the same time that it twisted everything around him. Robert Baratheon never got to raise a son, and even if he had, that son would have been molded in grief, in revenge, in bitterness. Jon had been spared that fate, not by mercy but by lies. And those lies, cruel as they were, gave him the space to grow into something purer. Something Robert might have respected, even admired, if he could have seen past the blood in Jon's veins. It was strange. Robert spent his life chasing a woman he didn't understand and hating a man he never really knew. In the end, he had neither, and Jon was the child of both. A war child, a mistake to some, a miracle to others. But to himself, Jon was simply Jon. No more titles, no more battles. They camped near a frozen river as night fell. Jon sat beside the fire, Ghost's head resting on his knee. Tormund passed him a skin of mead, but Jon waved it off. He stared into the flames. For the first time in years, the fire didn't remind him of Daenerys, of dragon wings blotting out the sun, of ashes falling like snow. It just reminded him of warmth. He closed his eyes. He remembered the first time he saw Robert, larger than life, loud, dressed in gold and black, a stag on his chest, laughter echoing off the stone walls of Winterfell. Jon had stayed back in the shadows. A bastard's place. Robert hadn't looked at him twice. But what would he have seen if he had? Would he have noticed something familiar in Jon's eyes? A stark softness? A Targaryen fire? Or would he have only seen a threat? Jon would never know. And he was done trying to answer questions no man could. By the time they reached the wall, Jon felt lighter than he had in years. The cold didn't bother him as it once had. It felt like home. Like truth. Castle Black stood as it always had, old, worn, crumbling, but proud. Fewer men guarded it now. The realm had little need for rangers. The great threat had come and gone. But for Jon, this place was sacred. It was where he found himself. Where he learned how to lead, how to lose, how to rise again. He passed through the gates without fanfare. No lords greeted him, no horns blew, and that was how he liked it. That night, he sat alone atop the wall, the stars bright above him, the winds howling like wolves in the dark. He took out the last thing he carried, a small folded scrap of cloth. Lyanna's colors, the blue rose pattern embroidered by hand, left to him in silence after Sam discovered the truth. He pressed it to his chest. "I hope I was worth your sacrifice," he whispered into the wind. "I hope you'd be proud of who I became." There was no answer. Only wind and stars and snow. And that was enough. Days later, Jon rode out beyond the wall with the free folk, north of North. No more castles, no more names. Just a vast open world waiting to be walked. He turned one last time, looking south. He thought of Robert, how the man had dreamed of a strong son, a worthy heir, someone who would wield honor like a sword and carry legacy without letting it rot him from within. Robert had never found that son, but fate, cruel and poetic as always, had birthed him anyway. Not from his own blood, but from the union of his greatest love and his greatest enemy, Jon Snow, the bastard who wasn't, the heir who never ruled, the king who never wore a crown, the man who became everything Robert Baratheon ever wanted, but was never strong enough to raise. And as Jon turned back toward the wild, leaving behind all ghosts and crowns, one thing finally became clear. He had nothing left to prove. Not to the realm, not to history, not even to the dead. He was free.